All right. So anytime I get to interview a fellow Terp, it's a good day. It's a
Let's
darn
do
good.
it.
Yeah, Dave, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Kevin. It's good to see you again.
Likewise, we were just I guess partly commiserating on the weather here in the Mid Atlantic. I was saying yesterday we had a little sun pop through, and right back to clouds and rain and kind of the doom and gloom of the fall, I guess.
We had rays of hope yesterday, but
We
only
did.
for a few hours.
We did. All right. So weather aside, I've been looking forward to this because you and I were connected. Gosh, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, something
Yeah, at
like
least.
that. And
At least.
yeah, we've got so many common ties, between our organizations and personally, and obviously Maryland. As I've been looking forward to this, so this will be, I think it's certainly a fun one for all. So let's kind of like jump in. Let's get kind of background. Kind of early Dave, where you from? Were you technical by nature early on? What was early Dave like?
I would say technical by nature early on would be a wild understatement. Because
Oh yeah.
my story's kind of unusual. I was born in 1970, so I was born like right at the right time to just experience the personal computer revolution in my early life. And my father was an NSA, National Security Agency lifer, trained as an electrical engineer.
We've got another tie there. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and one of the byproducts of that for me was he actually got a computer kit. It was called a Heath kit, and like assembled this thing. And I don't mean like put the video card in and assemble. I mean like solder stuff into the motherboard. And it took 6 months to build this thing. It had 64K of RAM, not really any graphics. It was only text graphics. It was a Z80 based machine. And so I was, I guess, 7 when we got that. And I immediately started trying to write programs, started typing them in. Remember, you might not be old enough to remember this, but Creative Computing Magazine and Byte Magazine, they would have basic listings, and you would type them in and they wouldn't work because the basic dialects would be different across the different machines. Wow. So then I would have to sit there and figure out how to make it work. And I kind of just learned to code basic from just doing this. And I just became completely obsessed with programming to the point where I really didn't want to do anything else. And that continued, I mean, even to this day. And I guess for me, it was like having an infinite toy box, because you could make your own new toys. You didn't have to have physical materials to make stuff. Just think it and type it. And I thought that was just so amazing and empowering. So I started very young as a programmer, always wanted to be a developer. And, like you said, went to University of Maryland, did computer science and linguistics there. And from there, it was kind of the die was cast. I also was always really entrepreneurial. So I have a funny story where my mom is a freelance writer. And back then, the tools were very primitive. So you could edit on the screen, but printing, they didn't have all the printing capabilities like formatting. So one of the things that she wanted was to submit her manuscripts. They would have to follow certain rules. The typist would have to follow certain rules, like put a header on each page and a footer and a page number and double space. And the machine wouldn't do that automatically. So she paid me to write her a program to do this. And I don't know, charged her $20 or something. And I made a user manual and I put a tech support number in there, which was our home phone. Like, it was clear that when I was 10 or whenever this was, I was like really into being, software sales guy, software entrepreneur. And it's never left me.
How consuming was it when you were younger? Was it one of these things where it's all you could think about? It was a problem.
Yeah,
there, and you got to solve it.
I was a very bad high school student because I basically would stay up till 3 a.m. every night coding and then sleep through all my classes. So yeah, I got better. I got more disciplined in college, but yeah, I was pretty much allowing computing to dominate everything in my life until college.
Yeah. So there's a million directions that you could have gone, right? I guess 70s. You're talking, late 80s, early 90s, they're, it's
Yeah.
right at the front end of the, computing, boom, I guess, right? Where PCs and, they were becoming,
And actually cybersecurity too. In
yeah,
fact, one of the
yeah.
other interesting lucky things for me of being in Maryland and near the NSA was in high school, I worked for one of the first cybersecurity companies and literally the first people who made a commercial firewall. They were called Trusted Information Systems, started by a guy named Steve Walker, who was ex-NSA. He actually authored what's called the Orange Book, which the old salts in the industry know what that is, but it was called Trusted Computing then. It wasn't called cybersecurity yet. It was more about making the operating itself secure. And they made this open source thing called Firewall Toolkit. And companies were like, can we buy this from you? Can we buy support? And it turned into what was called the Gauntlet Firewall.
Wow.
Which if it wasn't the first commercial one, it was certainly one of the very early ones. And they went public on that. They were acquired by Network Associates. But I worked for them when I was in high school and in college. So I actually had early exposure to these issues of secure computing, trusted computing, cryptography. I wrote code for them. I was probably not quite at the level of their, but a true professional programmer, but I could do useful stuff even in high school. I think I contributed to Trusted Xenix.
Wow.
Actually contributed to Trusted Mock. So Mock operating system was developed at Carnegie Mellon University and is the progenitor operating system in some senses of not only Windows NT, but also Mac OS. Not that I had anything to do with those projects, but it's just interesting. I completely randomly got to work on this very important, operating system that ended up being kind of the dominant commercial basis of the dominant commercial operating systems, if you think about it.
So how did that come about? Being in high school. I know, like having grown up in this area as well, and having
So
a lot of
it's the usual thing. You got to
mm,
know somebody. I mean, my mom was a writer. She had a writer friend who knew Steve Walker
mm,
and said, "Oh, he should go try to get a job at TIS." And so my mom said, "You got to call them," which I did. And they said, "No, we're not hiring anyone in high school." And I said, "Mom, they're not going to hire me." And she's like, "Well, call them back." I'm like, "They said no." I'm like, "So what? Call them back." So basically, because she prodded me to do this is a great life lesson for a 15-year-old. I called them back like 6 times, and eventually their executive admin, Betty, was like, "Fine, you can come in. Just stop calling me." So I came in and they would like interviewed me and they were like, "Man, this kid actually like knows stuff about Unix and can program, and yeah, we'll give him a job. We'll pay him like $10 an hour." So it's just the perfect early example of persistence pays off, and it's all about relationships, right?
So would you say kind of your father brought the technical, kind of the NSA, the technical side, and then your mom was kind of the persistence? Did you pick up sales from your mom, or
Not so much sales, but I would
Mhm.
say negotiating,
Yeah,
some early concepts of negotiating, because she had a very, very good literary agent who negotiated. And freelance writing is such a brutal business. It was a
mm,
perfect petri dish for me to see for my future career in software entrepreneurship, because
yeah.
it's just, I mean, it's just brutal. So, I think if anything, it probably taught me to be more cynical and paranoid than a normal person would be, maybe to the
Right.
point where it's even unhelpful. But it was certainly a great learning experience to watch her sort of navigate all these, negotiations and relationships.
Yeah. So after Maryland, what was next? You had a really interesting, experience early on, and then you're at the University of Maryland, and what was next for you?
Yeah, so I applied to 2 schools after Maryland for grad school, Maryland itself and
Mhm.
MIT. And I just thought, well, what the hell? I'll apply to MIT. I'm not going to get in, but they have a great linguistics department. And I did that partly because one of my professors at Maryland had worked with the professor at MIT who kind of did run the linguistics department. And, she basically said, you absolutely should go there and work in his group. And so she advocated for me. And ultimately, yeah, I got in. And so I was at the AI lab there in the PhD program. And stayed there for about 2 years. My first day there, which I wasn't even officially a student yet, I was at this kind of, they have you come in April and they try to sell you on going there. Because
Mhm.
most of the people who get into MIT, they also got into Stanford and every other, so they want you to come there. If they, unlike me, I didn't even apply to those places. But anyway, so I went there in April, and the first guy I met was this guy, Andy Gavin, who was like, "Oh yeah, I like writing video games too," which I had always liked making games. I never did it commercially, but that was kind of what I like to do. Kind of the programming I like to do is games. And I had done some shareware games and stuff like that, but nothing commercial. And he's like, "Oh, well, my friend Jason and I, we've been making and selling games since we met in 7th grade Hebrew school." And I'm like, "What do you mean selling games?" He's like, "Well, our most recent game was just published by Electronic Arts and sold 175,000 copies." And I'm like, "Holy
Wow.
crap." Like, you've really been selling games like commercially? And they had really been selling games commercially since they were like 12. I mean, it's ridiculous. So
Wow.
I immediately became really good friends with him and with Jason. And ultimately that led to them essentially hiring me as their first technical employee, because they basically, they did a game kind of out of their apartment that they self-funded, which was like a Mortal Kombat kind of game
Hmm.
for a system that didn't go anywhere called the 3DO. Very interesting system because it was the first system that was really genuinely polygonal 3D based graphics, but it was way too expensive, and so it didn't really get much traction. But they made this game for it, and they kind of parlayed that game into a deal with Universal Interactive Studios, which was a new division of Universal, the movie company and the theme park company, dedicated to making games.
Hmm.
And essentially, they got advanced $1.5 million to make a game. And so then the two of them are like, "Oh, we gotta make this game. Andy's not gonna be the only programmer. That's
Right.
impossible. Who else can we hire?" And so, they basically said, "You should come and join us and be kind of the I was one of the two developers with Andy. Andy and I basically wrote the first game, and that turned into what ultimately was Crash Bandicoot, which came out in 1996 for the PlayStation 1. So the two of us
Wow.
wrote the code, and then we had 5 other people who did all the art. Jason and Andy ran the company. Jason was kind of mostly the business guy, and Andy was mostly the technical guy, although they both did, Jason was also a really good artist. So they both kind of had blended roles. But I was mostly like in the background, like coding 20 hours a day. So, and, we didn't know that we had no idea the game would be so successful. We tried to make a
Yeah.
good game, obviously, but it all sort of changed for all of us when Sony came to Universal and said, "Hey, they didn't say this, but it was the case. We've been struggling to make a character-based game that competes with Mario." And they had tried at least 3, probably if you count 4 times to do this
Hmm.
in-house. And the games were okay, but they all were kind of like meh.
Hmm.
And certainly compared to Mario, which was just this epically amazing game franchise,
Yeah.
these were super lame in comparison. So they kind of capitulated because they're like, "Okay, the 1996 holiday season's coming. We have nothing. What are we going to do?" And so they basically went to Universal and said, "We want to have the rights to publish this game under our first party branding and do it as what's called a pack-in. It comes with some of the PlayStations that people buy in the box." And of course, that just makes the difference between selling 100,000 copies and like millions and millions.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
And And so that's sort of how that game, which we had called it internally Willy the Wombat, became Crash Bandicoot.
Wow.
um, One of the artists and I came up with the name Crash because one of the formative things in the game was we added boxes, little crates that you smash into. And that's also kind of an interesting side story. I think everyone thought the name Crash was weird when we proposed it.
Hmm.
Like, and they were like, "It's not a name. Like, how can you just?" I'm like, "See, but that's good because then we can own that term as a name. We just made it a name, and eventually it'll sound normal." And Taylor and I, the artist, convinced people, "Yeah, this will work. We should do this." And they're like, "Okay, I mean, sure." And then the guy who had given them the contract, the Universal senior executive who had given them the contract, Skip Paul, who's also a very interesting figure in the history of video games, he said, well, it shouldn't be a wombat. What even is a wombat? And he's looking through this book that we had. We had all these books on Australian and Tasmanian marsupials because the artists wanted to know, well, what are these creatures that live in this area that we're at least mimicking, if not trying to replicate. And he's flipping through and he's like, oh, there's this one called a bandicoot. That's cool. Why don't you make him Crash Bandicoot? And we're like, okay, you're the boss. It's Crash Bandicoot now. So again, that game came out September 96. We did a sequel that came out the year later. And I actually, after that, left to do a new startup with another person that I had met at MIT. Actually, two people I met at MIT. And a totally different thing. It was like travel technology. And the reason I left was just, it was such a burnout. Like, it was such a burnout business. I mean, especially for Andy and me. We just think about it. Like, Nintendo had 60 plus people working on Mario 64. We had 7 on Crash. I mean, it was, wow. For the second one, we did hire 2 more programmers who were both incredible. But still, you're talking 4 developers for a game that had to be made in 9 months. And I was really kind of fried at the end of that. And I also had seen my office mate at MIT, Carl, had come to LA and shown me what he was working on, which was this new travel planning technology. And I was like, wow, that's really game changing. And I made the kind of difficult decision over a few months. Like, I want to go do that. I don't want to work 100-hour weeks anymore. Right. And I want to work on this thing that could really change the world again in a different way. And that was a company called INKY Software, but ultimately became Google Travel because Google acquired the company 15 years later, in 2011. Wow. So I went from, cybersecurity to video games to travel technology, and then most recently back to cybersecurity with my current company, INKY. So I don't know how to explain that journey so much, but it's just what happened.
That's great. I mean, it's I think you kind of get in some of the leadership and CEO roles and duties, but yeah, I think just having different experiences in different industries and different roles within those industries, ultimately leads to becoming a better CEO and just it gives you different perspective from a strategic standpoint because you're solving different problems. Maybe the frameworks to solve those problems are similar, but they're different, right? And what's fascinating, right, is that you're at the early days of 3 very interesting, industries, right? Security, gaming, and then into the travel space, right? That each to their own are, today and even back then, they're multi-billion, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars of industries, right? And
totally, massive.
Maybe to see the early days of that and to see these industries, develop the way they have over the last 20, 25 years is probably, it's gotta be pretty, I don't know, nostalgic, or it's gotta be pretty rewarding.
It was, I mean, it's really exciting to be involved in the cutting edge of something new that is going to be important. And also, I think, at least with, well, I mean, in both of those cases, both Naughty Dog, which was the company that made Crash, and INKY Software, which was the company that became Google Flights. In both of those cases, we made, I think, a significant contribution to those early periods. Like, there were 3D games, Quake and Doom, obviously, even back to Wolfenstein 3D, massively influential. There were games like System Shock and Ultimate Underworld. These were all PC games that were very early 3D. You couldn't really do this stuff on consoles, so it was all done on PC early. And we were completely obsessed with those games. Mario 64 was a massive innovation, and I think Crash can be said alongside those as it made a really serious contribution. Yeah, it's also fascinating if you look at almost 30 years later how much more complex games are. I mean, games are wildly complex pieces of software to the point where they're probably among the most complex pieces of software there are. And the teams that make them are hundreds and hundreds of people. So our stuff made by 7 people that ran in 2 megabytes of RAM was kind of this like little seedling compared to the stuff now. And that's also kind of cool to see how it's evolved just in my lifetime.
Yeah. So you mentioned the company was
ITA,
ITA.
ITA,
Sorry,
which originally
ITA.
started out as Internet Travel Agent.
That
But
makes sense.
we had two problems with that. One was somebody already was calling themselves Internet Travel Agents, so there was
Oh,
a trademark dispute. And the other problem was we weren't really a travel agent. So we
sure.
decided, well, we'll just call it ITA, and we'll say it stands for Ivory Tower Algorithms.
There you go. All
So,
right, I got you.
but yeah, it was kind of a generic name, but it didn't matter because we sold exclusively to companies. We weren't selling to consumers. We sold to airlines to power their websites. Um,
Ah,
like
so
airlines still can't price their own airline tickets without third-party software. It's so
right.
complicated. And we'd also sell to travel intermediaries. Like Orbitz was one of our early customers. We powered Kayak as well.
Wow. So you were there for say about 15 years. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Jeremy, who was the original founder and
Mhm.
CEO of the company, founded it, I think, 96.
Mm.
I think Carl joined in 97, and then I joined in late 97. And we sold 20. Well, we agreed to sell in 2010, but it took 10 months to close. So it didn't actually close until April 2011.
Wow.
And then I didn't stay. I didn't stay at Google. I kind of wanted to do another startup because I'm insane.
Oh, yeah. I feel your pain. But so 10 months to close, I think we were kind of talking that there was some pain involved in that process.
Yes, it was
Yeah.
the kind of learning experience you cannot often come across in a normal entrepreneurial career. The issue was Microsoft, Kayak, a few others essentially convinced the Department of Justice to sue Google to block the acquisition of our company on
Mm.
antitrust grounds. So literally right now, there's a Google antitrust trial happening, but the first Google antitrust trial was DOJ versus Google over the acquisition of ITA software. And
So
so
you
what happens is if the DOJ doesn't like something about your deal, they can send you what's called a Hart-Scott-Rodino request, which is like, we want a big information dump about this acquisition. And almost always that's it. They look at the HSR request documents and they say, okay, we're okay with it.
mm,
We had concerns, but we're okay with it. In cases where they're not okay, they ask you for a quote second request. And that's when you know you're totally doomed because you're going to be spending many, many, many months and many millions of dollars on lawyers, which is probably fine for Google because they're super rich. But getting acquired, we also had to spend millions of dollars on antitrust counsel.
wow.
Um, Ultimately, it was a really, really fascinating learning experience. I mean, I had vaguely been aware of the tenets of antitrust law, but certainly being on the receiving side of this stuff and I was chief operating officer. I was involved in the vast majority of the conversations that we had about these issues. Um, I learned a lot. It was pretty interesting. Um, and as an aside, my own kind of reaction to what's happening now is it seems like antitrust enforcement, which is actually done by two entities. It's either DOJ or FTC, depending on I don't know how they decide who goes after what case, but they do have some. It could be either one. They kind of went to sleep for 10 years after that, and now they're back, and you see they're suing Google and Amazon, and it's just sort of interesting how these things come and go and ebb and flow.
What 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 percentage of that antitrust suit was really just generated by Microsoft or just more competitive factors versus DOJ really wanting to dig in on you guys?
I'm fairly cynical person, as I mentioned. I think the vast majority was catalyzed by Microsoft.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I think they had, let's just say, they had learned the power of antitrust enforcement in prior years,
Yes, they did. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think they cynically regarded it as, well, it'll just screw them up for a while, even if we don't prevent the acquisition. Um,
Right.
I mean, and interestingly, Microsoft had also wanted to acquire ITA. So I think that particularly irked them that in some sense, Google kind of trumped them.
Yeah, it's
I can't
so
go into
they
any
were,
detail on any of that, but that's basically part of the thing. Is often when there's one of these acquisitions, I think you saw it with Mandiant too recently.
Mhm.
The one who loses is very unhappy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's got to be expensive. I mean, I guess at scale, right? I mean, that you know, a Microsoft or some of the big groups, you know, they kind of build that into their, you know, their model, but you're still, you know,
Yeah.
you're still losing millions and millions of dollars for less than desirable outcome. So you kind of went back to, you know, as most of us crazy entrepreneurs do. You said, all right, I'm out and it's time to start something new. So what was next?
You know, I kind of started an incubator informally, just to incubate my own ideas and self-fund them. And I was really, really interested in email. I don't know what that says about my personality, but I was really interested in email because email dates back to 1971. It's one of the first things, one of the first protocols on the internet was SMTP. And it's totally ubiquitous. I mean, arguably still more people use email than any other communication medium except maybe phone. Even though it's been supplanted technically by so many other media, it's kind of like baked into the cake, you know? And so I was intrigued by the fact that it's pretty universal at that time. And I think even still today, it's kind of the main way that you would communicate with people in other companies. Right? I mean, if you think about, we need to talk to this company, like you can set up a Slack channel, but that's kind of something you do later if you're really partnering.
Right.
The way you communicate normally is you're like, send them an email, right? And so email seemed to me to be likely to last forever, or at least from this perspective of my lifespan, forever.
Right.
And also I felt like I knew it had a lot of security issues, because actually one of the things that also trusted information systems worked on in the 80s was what's called privacy enhanced mail, which was ultimately became what's called SMIME, which is like, can we graft things like end-to-end encryption on email?
Yeah.
So I was aware of that stuff. And I also thought email productivity was awful, because when I was a COO at IT, I'd get 800 mails a day. And I'm like, there's no way a human can deal with this. This is insane.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in both productivity elements of email and security email elements of email. And ultimately, you know, by, I would say 2012, maybe 2013, certainly in that window, we were like, we got to solve the security problem, partly because consumer was just so difficult. Selling anything to consumers was so hard. Certainly in the wake of the iPhone, like Apple owned mail on their device, you know, Google owned the mail client on Android. You're not going to get anyone to use a new mail client. We tried, but it's basically impossible.
Sure.
And even if you can, consumers aren't going to pay for it. They have a free thing on their phone. So we really focused on security because we thought, well, companies will pay to secure their email, which ultimately was true. It's a lot more complicated than that. We started with a client solution that was end-to-end encryption for email. So you could take any email account, add it to our client, and you'd magically get, you know, completely end-to-end encrypted communication like you get on something like Signal. And that, I think, was a really impressive achievement that should have changed the world, and no one cared. And I think part of the reason no one cared is because, again, the client thing is a non-starter. You know, you'd get feedback like, well, I can't make my CFO use anything but Outlook. She just won't do it.
Right.
And if we can't get the CFO to do it, what's the point? So there's a huge barrier to entry around the client, control of the client. And the other thing I found, sort of to my astonishment, was a lot of CISOs thought, oh, we already have that. We already have it. I'm like, you don't have end-to-end encrypted email. There's email encryption in transit when the servers talk to each other. But this was when, as an entrepreneur, you realize you're having to educate your buyer that they need something, you're dead.
Yeah.
You can be upset about that and feel like, oh, they should know this, but like, you're just dead. So we abandoned that but we knew that we'd have these conversations. The CISOs would be like, "You got anything on phishing? Because that's my big problem with email." And so after a while, we're like, "Hey, we should solve phishing in email." Genius idea. So I would say by 2015, we were focused entirely on solving this email phishing problem. And partly that was appealing to us. I had brought in a guy who had done his PhD on semi-supervised machine learning, so very high power machine learning person as a chief scientist for us. And we both kind of looked at this and said, "Hey, you know what? This is really about, at the end of the day, this is about impersonation."
Mm-hmm.
So most of these fish are like a mail that's pretending to be some brand, or pretending to be some person. And it occurred to us there are really powerful tools that have been developed in the 2010s and early, to some extent, even early 2020s, but really in the 2010s, that would help us solve this impersonation problem. So, for example, we thought, well, if somebody's impersonating Microsoft, that only works because the human recognizes that it's Microsoft somehow. They recognize the brand indication. So what are the things they see? I mean, they're looking at the mail, so it's got to be visual, right? So what are the things they see and read that convince them it's Microsoft? It's obviously like images and text, right? So in some sense, it seems, oh, this is easy. Like the computer scientist, machine learning person says, this is easy. I'll just make the machine recognize those brand indications just like a person. And we knew there were tools to do things like classify imagery. For example, there were tools like, even then, Google Photos and things, you could say, show me pictures of cats in my photo album. And that worked because they had trained neural networks on a zillion images of cats, and the neural networks somehow learned, well, that's cat-like features in that image, and this one doesn't have cat-like features, right? So we thought, well, that'll just work for brand images, right? As you might expect, it was a lot more complicated, and it took us 6 generations of iterating on that computer vision engine. But now we actually do have an engine that's human levels of accuracy able to recognize branding, at least very close to it. And we knew that would be a really useful tool, because if the machine knows, hey, if I'm a human, I'm going to think this is Microsoft, then the machine can say, well, now let me go verify it's from Microsoft using things that everyone's heard of in the mail security world, like DKIM, which lets Microsoft digitally sign all their mail. So you can say, I can prove that mail came from Microsoft.com or one of the 100 mail servers. And those are legit for Microsoft. So this must be a good mail. And the alternative is, well, if it's not from one of those, it's probably not legit. So it gave us a really powerful tool to solve this problem, I like to say, from first principles, and also in a way that generalizes to new examples. So a lot of mail security historically has been about, there's a new technique by an attacker, put a bunch of regex patterns in to detect that specific type of mail, and keep doing that forever. It's like whack-a-mole. And what's nice about this kind of technique that relies on first principles is we don't have to have a big list of valid Microsoft mails, just like you don't as a human. Every mail that comes to you that's from Microsoft, you're immediately like, oh, it's Microsoft. Well, you can generalize to new examples, right? So you don't have to have a big list anywhere. And that's really, really powerful because it helps deal with the 0-day problem.
Yeah.
So we built a whole mail protection system around this, focusing on protecting mail coming from the internet, and competitive with incumbents like Proofpoint and Mimecast and the usual suspects. But we were able to detect a lot of stuff that got through those systems. The other thing that we realized around the same time, probably 2017 or so, was, hey, you know how companies, they'll put this like external tag on their mail? They'll say, hey, this is external, use caution.
Sure.
We're like, that's kind of interesting, but it's really useless because, first of all, it goes on almost every mail, so you just ignore it. You become blind to it. That's a problem. And second of all, what does that tell me to do? Like, it's external, use caution. What does that mean? But we liked the idea of informing users right in the email. So over, again, many, many generations, we evolved this into what's really now an email assistant that feels like it lives in your inbox, which kind of matches our branding. We're called INKY, and we have this little octopus character that is our mascot. It kind of matches like, oh, INKY's there in your inbox, like helping you out and giving you advice. And it takes the form of, just like the external tag, it's just HTML that we inject in the mail. It's color coded, so we have gray, yellow, and red. Reds usually will just go to quarantine, so most customers set it so the end users don't see those.
Mm-hmm.
But the yellows are really important because they can say, like, not just external, but one of 75 different things.
Sure.
That are tailored to the content of the mail. And we also kind of manage the rate of these so that we don't put too many on. So 10 to 15% of emails will get yellows. And that ensures people don't become blind to them.
Complacent. Yeah. Yeah.
And so those two things, the better detection from using kind of, AI techniques we didn't invent, but adapted to this domain on the one hand, and then also really changing the user experience to make it a lot more helpful to the end user. Kind of like your car can do lane keeping for you. Even though the AI is not perfect enough to drive you from one place to another, the AI can give you this affordance of keeping you in the lane or maintaining a certain following distance. This is kind of similar. The AI is not perfect. It can't identify fish at human levels of accuracy yet. I would argue also humans can't do that either. So I don't know what humans' levels of accuracy really means.
Right. Yeah.
But it can sort of say, hey, I'm not sure this is bad, but like, this seems kind of weird. This isn't the kind of thing Kevin would normally write. So I'm going to give you a yellow caution banner that says that. And what we found is that makes people slow down and just think and not do the thing the email is asking them to do.
Yeah.
Which sometimes is clicking on a link. But increasingly now, since the attackers know everyone has giant feeds of bad URLs, there's no link, and they're just like, please buy gift cards or go, wire this money, or even more elaborate sort of schemes.
Yeah.
So it makes the user slow down and say, maybe I shouldn't actually go wire money or send all my W-2s to this person.
Yeah. You think, it's funny, you mentioned kind of just putting an external tag, right? I think for most of the folks and maybe the mid-teens, that was like that was, almost kind of considered that first layer of defense, right?
That's the solution, right?
Yeah. It was like the easiest thing. Just, this is from outside, and don't click on it or whatever, or use caution. But then, you've had to layer and layer and layer and layer, and you're at a point where, the bad guys, right, are pretty damn smart, and they're using AI, and kind of that rate of exploitation is incredible. I mean, again, keep going back to kind of Moore's law and just kind of rate of change and how these things, and you mentioned kind of whack-a-mole and the levels of sophistication. Although the way you talk about it is like, all right, it's pretty simple, but having been in this space and having known you guys for a while, right? I know the level of sophistication that's built in the back end. So how does this ever changing kind of AI landscape, and you see that accelerating? Do you see that making the challenge more difficult moving forward, or where's this going?
The answer is bluntly, absolutely yes. There are two things that you highlighted. I think they're both very interesting. One is the sophistication of the attackers. And the whack-a-mole thing, it doesn't apply in our case so much as we're just going to have a zillion regexes, although we do have that sort of engine as well. For us, it's more about the tactics evolve. So the attackers are incredibly sophisticated in ways that are really impressive, actually.
Yeah.
In terms of their use and knowledge of things that are very complicated, like Unicode, CSS, HTML. They know how Proofpoint works internally to a great degree, not just them, but all the incumbent systems. They know how regex engines work and how they can exploit them. So they're evolving tactics continuously. And one of the things that we do is we ask our customers permission, hey, can we have our analysts look at fish you report? we don't have any humans in the loop of detection ever, right? It's all machines.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for PII and other reasons, we can't have people looking at the mail.
Sure. Yeah.
But many customers, I would say the majority, let us see things that are reported as phish because those are malicious and unlikely to have anything PI in them. And they want to help us improve our detection. So we get a lot of this stuff, and we have a data team that analyzes these. And I think the key function there is we can see, hey, you know, this, I'll give you an example. This email is obviously a phish. It has a Microsoft logo in it. We have corroborating evidence in the mail. It's other corroborating evidence that suggests a human would believe this is from Microsoft. Why didn't we identify it as a Microsoft impersonation? This example is probably from 2 years ago now, but it's very instructive, I think. When the analyst looked at the mail, they realized that Windows logo in the mail is not an image. It's an HTML table with 4 squares, with each square colored the right color to be the Windows logo. And that's going to, you're like, whoa, that's clever.
Brilliant.
How are we going to deal with that? And so again, we'll try to think of ways to deal with a new category or a new tactic from first principles. So when we render the mail, now we take into account, well, it might not just be images in the mail, it might actually be image byproducts of other HTML elements, which makes the whole thing that much more complicated. That's one way that we're constantly seeing attackers evolve and make the problem harder. Attackers are also keenly aware, and I'm not saying all of them. I mean, there's lots of script kiddies out there, but I'm saying there are people out there who are very sophisticated. They are also aware of an important asymmetry that applies to all of cybersecurity, which is, if I'm a bad guy, how much work does it take me to send 1 million of these emails versus how much work does it take the white hats like INKY to detect my bad stuff? Because the white hats have to run the detection on every mail, you know, many millions of mails a day.
Right.
I only have to send my 10 million or whatever, and I only have to get a few of them through to win as the bad guy.
Yeah.
And so they're very keenly aware of things that cost more on the receiving side. So one example we've seen recently, we've put a lot of work into this when we started seeing it probably 3 months ago, is QR codes in email.
I was just going to ask you about that. Yeah.
So think about this. So QR codes became totally normalized because of the pandemic. You go to a restaurant, that's your menu, which I personally hate, but that was the thing. So now regular people are like, oh, QR code, I'm supposed to scan that. So there again, very smart attacker says, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll put my malicious links in QR codes, and I'll make it look like it's some kind of Microsoft authentication thing, or like genius. It's like totally brilliant social engineering on a massive scale.
Yep.
And they also know, oh, I bet they don't look at QR codes. I bet like none of these guys look at how they don't do that. Oh, and you know what? How are they going to do that? They're going to scan every image in every single mail and see if it's a QR code and decode it. In our case, the answer is yes. But in the case of a larger company that's an incumbent whose primary job is to manage their gross margin, the last thing the CFO wants to hear is, hey, we're going to spend a lot more compute power because we're going to have to scan every single email for QR codes.
Right.
So those, I think, both highlight the advantage of an approach like ours, where we're constantly looking for these new tactics, and also the flexibility we have as a non-giant company to say, look, we're going to make an investment and spend more money per email because we have to solve this problem because this stuff's getting through. And it's one of those weird ways. There's a legendary investor called Mike Moritz. He actually was on our board at ITA, the travel tech company. He's talked a lot about the advantages that startups have, because obviously startups have mostly disadvantages versus big incumbents. They have far fewer resources. They usually have no lawyers, certainly not as many as somebody like Apple. You lose by default on anything legal to a big company if you're a startup. Nobody's heard of you. Initially, no one trusts you. Like, who are you guys? Never heard of you, right? There's this whole set of barriers.
Yeah.
But Mike would talk a lot about, well, what are the advantages? One of the advantages is if you have to deal with a radical change in an industry that's like a structural dislocation that creates massive value opportunity, which is very common in technology. If you're a startup, you don't have any village to burn down. You don't have anything, right? You don't have a giant revenue stream that's about to be cannibalized and wreck a whole division's bonus structure. You can just go and do the right thing. And I think another one of these is like this sort of what's called COGS, the cost of your the cost of offering the service. It's important to us, but not so important that we can't make a conscious decision to invest more in things like detection that cost money. That's way, way, way harder for a company owned by private equity or a public company to do. It's a huge advantage for us. The most stark example gets to your second point, which is AI. And, I was in AI in the 90s. We talked a lot about, I was in the language part trying to make machines understand language, but there were people doing computer vision and robots. And we all talked about, what will it take for a machine to truly be intelligent? And there was this very sharp division between what you could do. You could solve some problems like image recognition or make a program parse the syntax of a sentence. It was a very long way away from someone thinking that entity was intelligent.
Sure.
And I think most of us, certainly I can speak for myself, believed it would be beyond our lifetimes that we would see that. And so when we got things like Chat GPT 3.5, we started to see, whoa, this is kind of getting close. And now 4, I think, is there. I wouldn't say it's as intelligent as a human. In some cases, it's much more intelligent than a human. But would you be fooled by it? Maybe. It doesn't necessarily think like a human. It tends to make a lot of stuff up. But I think the ultimate question about AI is, does this thing incorporate semantic understanding? Does it understand how the world works, how things work? And that was always the elusive goal for AI.
Sure.
It's very clear to me that whatever Chat GPT 4 is, it does understand a lot about how the world works. It's not perfect that it makes bizarro hallucinations and things that a human wouldn't, but it's hard to play with ChatGPT for more than a couple days and come away thinking it's just a stupid parrot. That thing incorporates vast semantic knowledge, like about how the world works.
Yeah.
So I think, as an aside, that is a civilization-changing development. It's not just going to disrupt our industry; it's going to disrupt the entire world, the entire civilization.
Yeah.
But for us, yeah, go ahead.
No, but please.
I was going to say, for us, it introduces a new one of these asymmetries. One of the aspects of these models is they're extraordinarily expensive. So to generate a token out of one of these large language models, a token is like a word or a piece of a word or a couple words, depends on how you define it, but it's not very much text. To generate a token out of one of these models is like hundreds of billions of floating point calculations. Now, people have done work with, well, let's not use floating point. Let's use like little tiny 4-bit numbers that are 0 to 15. Okay, but you're still doing 100 billion calculations for a couple words, right? So that's something that you obviously can't do on every email, right? You cannot take an email, paste it into an LLM, and generate an output. It's 5 orders of magnitude at least too expensive. Even we can't do that. We could spend more. We're not going to spend $50 on an email, right? How is that ever going to work economically? So it creates this profound asymmetry that benefits the attackers in the short term. Long term, I think there are ways to use these models indirectly and affordably. But again, the attackers have the upper hand. They've now created this massive new problem for us that we as the white hats have to solve.
Yeah, I was laughing a moment ago. You mentioned the QR code because I literally had gotten one of those emails this morning. I was dumbfounded that it actually got through. Obviously, we're not,
they're flooding the market with these now.
Yeah.
So we actually have code rolling out in production like this week to improve the QR detection because we deployed code a couple months ago that actually blocked a lot of it. Then they iterated on their tactics and they actually are doing them in places where it's even more expensive to deal with them, like oh, well, so I'll just put the QR code on page 2 of my Word doc that I attach. Okay, so now you have to look at every image and every attachment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they're actually, even in the last 2 months, have sort of ratcheted up the complexity imposed on us and the cost imposed on us.
Yeah. What scares me about all this AI and kind of this next gen GPT that just came out is that there's all kinds of examples popping up now of somebody, saying, or it's just illustrating, on a sheet of paper, visualizing what they want to have developed.
Yeah.
Right. And that's being, spit into the machine and coming back with legitimate, quality code. Right. And so on one hand, yeah, you can see that as that's going to revolutionize. It's going to help development, and there's a lot of good that comes of it. But inversely, right, that is scary, powerful.
It's scary.
Yeah,
It's scary to me in 2 major ways. There are others that I probably haven't thought of, but the first is this will displace a lot of workers.
mm-hmm.
And what we saw in the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century was automation displaced laborers. This one's going to displace knowledge workers.
Yeah.
So think about an insurance claims adjuster at a big insurance company. How big do you think that group is at a big insurance company? 100 people?
Yeah.
Hundreds of people?
Yeah.
Well, if you have ChatGPT 4, you don't really need hundreds. You need 5.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have the AI do the first pass on everything. And then the 5 are only required to spot check the things work. Yep. So now you've reduced the labor cost, the knowledge work labor cost of serving this function by 95%, 98%. That's great for the insurance company. What happens to all of those workers, right? And when you look at that at a mass societal scale, this is a terrifying development, I think.
Yeah, you're spot on. I think people talk about it. I guess the people that've been in this space, especially when GPT first came out, they were making that connection, that leap to how how revolutionary this is going to be, and how much of an impact it'll have, specifically on knowledge workers. I understood it at a high level, but I think having seen what I've seen here in the last week or two, I think it really, for me, just really framed it up. That just a couple examples that I've seen, in your example here as well, just really, I think emphasizes, or really it makes it real, potential downstream impact that it could have on just broader economies. And then kind of going back to the what can be done, it's almost like there's a whole, you're creating a whole new battlefield with this technology, right? I mean, there's the offensive, defensive, and for you guys, I have to imagine that's like the 4th, 5th rail, right? It's a different paradigm that you guys have to be thinking about, in solving the challenges that you're solving. They're going to accelerate. And I know you guys are obviously on top of it. And
we're sort of used to these guys doing new things that are smart. And I mean, this is certainly a bigger one, but I think the societal impact is scarier. I'm less worried about the AI death robot thing that Elon Musk and those guys were. Obviously, that'll be a problem eventually. I think there are geopolitical controls, like we have with nuclear weapons, that will contain that for a while. But nothing's going to make companies avoid doing things that enhance their profitability. They're going to do those things, right?
Sure.
Whether American companies do them or we have laws against it, other companies globally will definitely do it in other countries. So it will become a race to the bottom of how few humans can you use for a given task. And that's not great for the humans who have the jobs, right?
Yeah.
The other kind of scary thing, it's a little more metaphysically scary, I guess, is I went to a talk about Microsoft Copilot. This is going to be in everyone's hands really soon. It's already being baited at big customers of Microsoft's. I think we'll end up having a lot of our communications and documents and PowerPoints and Teams conversations just being had on our behalf by machines. So you basically say, hey, Copilot, write me a PowerPoint that makes the following case and sales pitch. But then they also demoed something where Frank didn't attend the Teams meeting, so he can just get a summary of what happened in the Teams meeting. So now why do we need humans on either side of that Teams meeting? Like, just don't have them. Obviously, that's reducing it to an absurd point, but it feels to me like there's some intermediate points that are not great. Like, you're going to be reading a document like, who actually wrote this? Did anyone write this? Or is this like spit out by the AI? And we know the AI knows a lot, but is it the same as having a person's convictions put in that document? I mean, I don't know what this will be like, but it seems potentially problematic to me. You know, I don't want to read only stuff or talk to only written by machines or only talk to machines. I don't know about you, but kind of want to talk to people.
I guess we're gonna have to start putting our phones down after all, and actually having real in-person, face-to-face conversations at some point.
I mean, this stuff's amazing. Like, the fact that this happened in our lifetimes is amazing to me.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, and again, it's accelerating at such a astronomical pace that I think it's gonna be beyond fascinating over the next 5-10 years, for sure. So one of the things I want to really touch on, and I know we've got kind of limited time, but you guys have you've done, I think, a masterful job in creating a program that speaks to the channel. Right, you guys cut your teeth in enterprise and solved. These are challenges that SMB and mid market have always experienced. But early on, enterprise had the budget and understanding that they had to start tackling these issues, right? And so you guys did a great job in tackling these challenges in enterprise. But you guys made a pretty significant shift, maybe a year ago or so, a year and a half ago, and really have kind of gone all in on channel. And maybe kind of just speak to that real quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, the enterprise play is favored by investors for a bunch of reasons. I think investors see it as, well, you could do $1 million deal with one company. If you do 50 of those, you're at 50 million ARR. That's easy.
Yeah.
Sounds easy. And I think also there's a historical sense that you're not a real company unless you have enterprise customers. You're sort of this second tier.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of pressure, I think, on new startups that have big ambitions to start with enterprise, or at least include it in their playbook. What we found is enterprise customers are incredibly demanding, particularly in categories that have existed for a long time. Like email security has been around since the 90s, right?
Yeah.
So the laundry list of requirements is very, very extensive. We actually got through all of that and have enterprise customers, but it was very expensive to get there. And we also found, in a lot of ways, we just have better product market fit with channel and MSP and MSSPs for a bunch of reasons. You mentioned our branding. I think our branding is more appealing to smaller entities. Like people are always worried, advisors and investors, like is GE going to use a mail protection thing that has an octopus logo? Really? My rhetorical answer was, people use a thing called Google. Like, what's that? I mean,
Right.
but maybe there's something to that. They wanted to have the branding with the guy in the hoodie and all caps font, and that's not us.
Right.
And then the other there were just some kind of architectural elements that became really fixations for enterprise buyers. We made the decision early on, we were going to really build an entire mail handling infrastructure based on the standard, which has been around for decades, SMTP, that will interoperate with any mail server everywhere, that gives us complete control of the end user experience from the point where the mail hits our MTA to the delivery to the end user. It's a lot harder to do that than it is to use the post-delivery APIs that are common now that Microsoft and Google have.
Right.
So most of our competitors went with the easier, hey, I'm not going to run mail servers and I'm not going to like mime parse mails and do all this stuff. I'm just going to use the APIs. And for a variety of reasons, that's more appealing to, I think, larger company buyers. For reasons I think that are fundamentally misguided, but again, it doesn't matter if you're trying to educate your buyer on something, you're already dead.
Yep.
And in contrast, the channel and MSP buyers, they just want something that blocks phish and prevents them from having their users get phished, because for them, that's an existential business issue.
Yes. Yep.
If you think about whether you're an MSP with 20 employees or you're one with 250 employees, what's kind of the worst case scenario? Well, it's your customer getting phished and ransomware, right? So they need something that solves this problem, full stop. And the decision is not made by an IT buyer in procurement. It's made by the person who runs the MSP and probably built it and is an entrepreneur themselves and thinks, this is like my business reputation. I've built this thing for 10, 15, 20 years. I'm not going to trash it because I'm going to use some inferior mail protection thing. I don't care how it's architected. If it solves the problem, that's the one I want.
Yep.
And, you know, we sort of saw that evidence of that even before we made this adjustment. And we had a lot of MSP customers that we kind of got without putting much effort into it. But there was this key moment where we just looked at this and said, God, this enterprise stuff is so hard. It takes so long to close a deal. And this MSP, we have like 2 people working on MSP and we're closing deals all the time.
Yeah.
Why don't we just put all the effort into that? And the only counter argument to that from a business MBA kind of perspective is, well, maybe the market's not big enough. But that's total nonsense. There's 40,000 MSPs in the US alone.
Yeah.
And what we're observing is a trend where MSPs are going up market and larger companies are saying like, hey, I'm not doing IT anymore. It just doesn't make any sense. I'm outsourcing it to these people who know what they're doing. I have one throat to choke if it gets screwed up. I'm going to manage the spend in one place. They charge me, per user per month. That's so much easier for me as a mid-sized company. Yeah. And we're kind of perfect for that scenario because we have the enterprise feature set, but we are a small company and very, very efficient. So we can offer it to the channel and the MSPs at a price that allows them to make a really, really good margin. And the other thing that kind of fascinates me, one of the feedback things we get unsolicited from our MSP customers is, you know what's great about you guys? You answer the phone and you fix stuff like quickly.
Imagine that.
I had always assumed that's just kind of table stakes.
Yep.
But if you think about it, the companies that are totally focused on enterprise, that's their bread and butter. So that's always going to make everybody else kind of second-class citizen. So I feel like we have a great opportunity to bring the sort of enterprise capable protection and controls and admin richness to a market that's much more cost sensitive, price sensitive. And we haven't become a giant behemoth that has some other constituency we care more about than them. They're all we care about, really. I mean, yes, we have enterprise customers too, but we don't have hundreds of them, like a Proofpoint does. Well, it has thousands of them. Yeah. And our revenue split is much more on the side of channel and MSP now. Yeah. So that's kind of our primary concern, right?
Yeah. I think that's extremely important, kind of that dedication. And like I said, I'm a big fan of what you guys have been doing, and it's been great to watch the evolution of INKY and where you guys are going. And from a fellow Terp, I'm rooting for you. So.
Thank you. Yeah, and look, I mean, I'd like to say we thought about this from the beginning. This was always the plan. No, it really wasn't. But yeah. I think a lot of what you see in successful startups is a resiliency and a willingness to try a different thing, even if it's scary. This company, we've done it at least twice, if not 3 times. Because remember, I mentioned earlier, we started out with an end-to-end encrypted mail solution.
Right.
We don't even have the code for that anymore. Just think about it.
Yeah.
So this is really the third pivot in some sense.
So what's the best way to get a hold of you or your team?
INKY.com/partners is we have a whole dedicated partner program, a very rich partner program, lots of sales enablement materials we can help with. We're very responsive. That's sort of the launching pad for that. I'm Dave at INKY.com. Anyone who mails me, I will mail them back. Yeah, we'd love to talk to you.
Awesome. Well, I think we could probably talk for a couple more hours at minimum. We didn't even get into some of the other common ties with folks like Dharma and others, but
we got to save something for the next one.
That's right. Yeah, we got to save it for the next one. But Dave, I thank you so much for jumping on. And like I said, I'm a big fan. I'm rooting for you guys. And
I'm a huge fan of what you guys are doing too, by the way. You guys are having an absolutely explosive growth. It's obvious to me just looking at social media, and it's so awesome to see that because you're such a great guy. You have such a great background, and channel program's just doing incredibly well, obviously. So the feeling's mutual, to be honest.
Awesome.
You're interviewing me, but I can still say that, right?
Yes, I'll take it. I'm not good with compliments, but I'll take it. So, well, look, again, it's been great, and we'll make sure we have all these links in the show notes, and we'll see you, hopefully in another episode.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks.
Take care.